All right, let's get started. Good morning and welcome to today's Mineta Transportation Institute Research Snap webinar. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick and I'm the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads two consortiums focused on improving the mobility of people and goods. The first, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation, is the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, and the second is the California State University Transportation Consortium, which represents the 23 CSU campuses in the state of California, and that's funded through the Road Repair and Recovery Act of 2017. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. During today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the chat feature or through the conference Q&A method. We are recording this webinar and it will be made available shortly after today's event so that you may view it again in the future. Now on to today's program. The transportation sector has been identified as one of 16 critical infrastructure sectors whose disruption would have a debilitating effect on our nation's security. Yet this report finds that only 60% of transit agencies have a cybersecurity preparedness plan. Today's webinar assesses the readiness of agencies to understand, mitigate, and respond to the growing threat of cybersecurity. Toward that end, it gives me great pleasure to introduce MTI Research Associate Scott Belcher, who serves as the Chief Officer of SFB Consulting, and previously he served as CEO of ITS America, among other leadership positions. Scott's co-authors, Terry Belcher, Eric Greenwald, and Brandon Thomas, will also be available today during the question and answer period. Now on to the good stuff. Scott, please take it away with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here. I'm really appreciative of the support that we've received from the Mineta Transportation Institute and the American Public Transportation Association and the Federal Transit Administration. So this was really an interesting study, and we had a lot of fun doing it. And we learned an awful lot, and we learned some things that we really didn't anticipate. So first, just a quick, let's see, let's get this. All right, let's try this. There we go. Okay. First of all, just a quick snapshot on cybersecurity. I think the important thing to take away from this slide and this part of the presentation is as people look at cybersecurity in today's date, they work off of the NIST framework. And what's important about that is it's not just technology, it's not just the network. It's the people, it's training, it's both IoT and it's both IT and IoT, and that's really critical as you think about cybersecurity. And it's a little bit of a good news and a bad news story, quite frankly. The good news is there's a lot of information out there. Cybersecurity has become an important issue. We hear about it every day, unfortunately. We hear about it in transit an awful lot recently. Just in the last couple of weeks, there have been a number of major breaches at MBTA, at SEPTA, in Montreal, and these have taken down some very large, sophisticated transit organizations. So there's a lot, and as a result, the federal government has invested some resources in it, and you've got state agencies that are putting money into it, and then you've also got industry associations that support it. Both APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, and AASHTO both are very supportive of transit, and APTA does an excellent job of giving its members a lot of resources and a lot of tools. So that's the good news. The bad news is transit agencies are really struggling with funding levels, and they have unfunded demands, and so they have to prioritize. We all have to prioritize, but I think transit agencies, particularly small and mid-sized transit agencies, are even in a worse situation. And so, so cybersecurity becomes yet one more very important priority that it gets stacked up against other issues. You take that, and then you combine it with many agencies simply don't have an accurate sense of their cybersecurity preparedness levels, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I think some agencies have an unrealistic sense that they're prepared, more prepared than they are, or that they understand more about cybersecurity than they do. And then, or that they don't need to do anything, that it's handled by IT, or that they're not going to be attacked. And so we were really kind of surprised. And at the end of the study, we walked away with a pretty sobering bottom line, and you've probably seen it in a lot of the media that's reported about this study, and that's that our bottom line was that the industry is simply ill-prepared for malicious cyber attacks and other cyber-related threats. And I'm a guy who spent more than 30 years in Washington, D.C. I make my living in Washington, D.C., so I really can't afford to make many enemies. And so writing a tagline like this is pretty hard, and I had to be pretty confident that I was right. And so the next slide is really is an interesting one, because it doesn't seem to support what I just said. So in our survey, we surveyed, we sent our survey out to all of the APTA public transit authorities, and we got more than a 30% response rate. And that was over 100 agencies that represented more than a third of the US population. So we had a very good response rate. I think the interesting thing is they self-selected. So these were agencies that chose to participate, but still a pretty good response rate, and it reflected the range of agencies. We had most of the big transit agencies were responsive, but we also, it was geographically representative, and it also had a number of small and mid-sized agencies were representative. Interestingly, only 22% responded that they had suffered an incident. This struck each of us as really odd and kind of inconsistent with everything that we knew to be true. If you look at the other studies that are out there about other industries, most organizations have suffered from a cybersecurity attack. If we just refer to the cloud environment, Dell did a study, and 82% of the organizations that they studied had suffered from an event. So that didn't quite sit right. And when we dug in, what was interesting is the agencies still kind of stuck to their guns, and they said, yeah, they believed that they were prepared to manage and defend against a cyber threat, and they thought they had enough information. Okay. But then once you dug a little bit further, then the story started to crumble. First of all, only 60% have cyber preparedness plans. It means 40% of those who responded to our survey, who self-selected and decided to participate, 40% did not have a basic cybersecurity plan. So they didn't know how to respond if they were attacked. 43% did not believe they had the resources to respond if they were attacked. So if they were attacked, weren't ready for it, they didn't know how to, and they didn't have the resources. And then almost 50% didn't audit their cybersecurity plan. So that's pretty striking. And then you add on top of that, there are a few basic policies that any operating entities needs to have in place, and not just for cybersecurity, but for security for security in general, particularly in an agency that's serving the public and serving the public safety. And those are things like log data maintenance roles, incident response plans, disaster recovery plans, continuity plans, crisis communication plans. And you can look at this, if you look at this chart, it's horrifying. I mean, we're talking about less than 50% on all of these basic plans. And if you don't have a plan, you can't prepare for it. And if you don't have a plan, you can't audit for it. If you don't have a plan, you can't assess your readiness. And so, so that starts to tell you how ready we are. And again, I recognize that if you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency. And if you've seen 100 transit agencies, you've still seen one transit agency. And so every transit agency is going to have a different disaster recovery plan, a different continuity and operations plan, but they need to have them in place nevertheless. Similarly, we found once we dug in that the agencies really lacked the staff and the sophistication that was necessary to be able to be responsive. So, first of all, only 41% did training on a regularized basis. Very few of them had certification, cybersecurity certification. There was some confusion over what certifications there needed to be. The one common theme we found when we did this is the ones that stood apart from the rest of the pack were those agencies that had hired from outside of the industry, hired cybersecurity professionals from outside of the industry, because they brought their expertise to transit and it really made a difference. So that's a really important takeaway. We also, a good news element we took out of the study is that transit agencies are starting to leverage outside vendors for cybersecurity support. And that's really important, particularly, again, for the small, mid-sized transit agencies and for the large ones. When you're talking about PII, personally identifiable information. And so, we found that 83% of our respondents had at least one vendor providing some type of cybersecurity tools or support. On the flip side, we found that only 38% of our respondents had standard clauses in their contracts that impose cybersecurity requirements on their vendors. So what does that mean? As a takeaway, you should be imposing upon your vendors that they have cybersecurity plans in place, that they meet cybersecurity requirements that even you can't meet. That's a way of transferring the liability from you to them and the responsibility from you to them. And if you're handling financial resources, personally identifiable information, that type of stuff, you want to transfer that responsibility to a vendor, and you want to make sure that they are in fact following all cybersecurity protocols. And that's an easy and an inexpensive tool. So we had a series of recommendations, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so that we can answer questions. First, at the executive branch, this is an interesting one conclusion. This is one of the few places that I've been where the industry really does want to be told what to do by the government. That every transit agency I talked to wanted to know what the rules were. Tell me what the minimum level of rules were. So that they really like so our recommendation to DHS and FTA, or the Department of Transportation, is that they set some basic cybersecurity standards, create some basic tools, create some basic documents, and then require that the transit CEO certify that it meets those basic requirements prior to receiving its federal funding. I know that's a little bit draconian, but the only way you're going to catch an agency's attention is by requiring the CEO to certify. And then also require that the CEO certify that it's either outsourced its PCI compliant, that it's outsourced its payment data to PCI compliant vendors. Again, as I mentioned before, that's a really important thing to do. Or if you are sophisticated, big enough, sophisticated enough, and there are a few transit organizations out there that want to manage their PCI data, personally identifiable, their financial data, that you certify that you are PCI compliant. So that's important. For the legislative side, we said we realized that we can't, that the executive branch can't do this without funding. And so our request to the legislature is that you fund both the executive branch and the transit organizations to comply with the requirements that we're recommending. At the association level, the associations have a lot to play here, have an important role to play here. Associations fill the gaps that the agencies can't play. They fill the gaps that they play a role where the industry can come and work with the transit agencies. So the associations can play a clearinghouse role. They can establish minimal guidelines for audits. They can create standard contract language. They can create model documents. They can create training modules and certification. It's really a win-win situation. And the good news is that APTA has already embraced the findings of this study and is engaged in a lot of these activities already. And we're working very closely with APTA to try to help them move this forward. And then finally, the transit operators, there are a lot of things that transit operators can and should do, and they can and should do them right now. First and foremost, the transit operator should have an assessment, a maturity assessment of their cybersecurity capabilities. And I'm talking about even if you're operating 4 buses or 400 buses and trains, you need to know where you are, you need to know how you stand up, and you need to do that every year. Once you've done that, then you can prioritize what you can do, what the risk profiles are, and what the costs are, so that you can plan for your investment to bring yourself up to speed and into compliance. And then you need to create that periodic annual cybersecurity audit to identify shortcomings. Outsource, as I sound like a broken record, but again, outsource the PCI information. Make sure you audit your contracts to make sure that you've got cybersecurity provisions in them. That's not an expensive venture to do that audit. It might be challenging to get some of your vendors to be responsive, but until you start requiring them of that, they're not going to do it. Make sure you have the basic plans in place. Again, that's something you can work with APTA, work with some of the vendors out there, but you've got to have those plans in place, and you've got to again, on a regular basis, make sure that they're up to speed and that you're ready to respond. And then finally, you need to realize it's not a matter of whether you're going to be breached. It's a matter of when, and it's not a matter of whether. It's a matter of how often. you are being breached on a regular basis, and the costs are significant. And it's not an IT function. It's not the guy in the basement who's keeping the network running. Your greatest vulnerability, quite frankly, may very well be your receptionist. And COVID has made things even more, it has increased the risk. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll answer questions. I've kind of run through that, and we've got a few minutes, so please, I'll open it up for any questions. And my colleague, Eric Greenwald and Terry Belcher are both with us.
Well, fantastic, Scott. Thank you so very much. We have had some questions that were submitted in advance of your presentation, but before I go through those, I have my own question. You started your comments by indicating that recently both VTA, SEPTA, and other entities had suffered cyber breaches. Can you tell us a little bit more about that first? And second, this doesn't seem to be common knowledge, so are agencies trying to keep this information a little bit closer to home, or what is the impact of these breaches?
No, it's a great question, and the answers are complicated. If you read our study, we start with probably the most infamous breach, and that is in BART, in your home territory, where they installed 1,000 pirated switches in one of their extensions. And only because they had some very sharp cybersecurity professionals that they had recently hired, and they had brought some tools of the trade from outside of the industry, they determined that those switches were in fact had been recycled and from hostile nations, and had chips in them that were sending information back to those hostile nations. And right now it is an international criminal investigation that implicates more than 20 transit organizations, as well as a number of very prominent vendors whose names many of us know, and who many of the transit organizations that are on the line do business with. It's not, if you're in this space, it's not something you want to talk about, and not something you want to brag about, and you don't want to make yourself vulnerable. So it is not something that is regularly talked about and regularly shared. What does happen is ultimately when it affects ridership, and we saw that in SEPTA. SEPTA's in Philadelphia. They had a breach in which they lost, they were not able to communicate electronically with their ridership for 2 weeks. That's kind of hard to keep quiet. And it had an impact on their ability to serve their customers. So yeah, these things are real. They have both economic and service implications.
So I hear from your answer that it could not only be a disruption in customer service elements, but there could be a more fatalistic outcome, certainly as we talk about positive train control and other elements that are being introduced. So thank you for looking into this. And that leads me to a question from one of our attendees. Has the pandemic increased transit agencies' cyber vulnerabilities?
Absolutely, and that's something we're looking into right now, as a matter of fact. It has, mainly because it's increased the threat vectors. And if you think about it, we have more people working at home, we have more people accessing our critical networks, and we're accessing them from non-secured networks. And so the more we have access, and the more we access them from coffee shops and from our home, the more we're opening ourselves up, and it's harder and harder to protect ourselves, and harder to harden our networks, and it's harder for the IT people to keep us safe. So yeah, it's definitely increased our vulnerability.
And is there also an impact from many of us across the nation are doing distance learning with our children? So we're in a home where we're working, our child is going to school. Children's decision making might not be as robust or thoughtful as others. Does that introduce another element of risk?
Sure. You leave your computer on, and your child happens to walk by and wants to get on Google, or wants to access yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in brave new territory, and quite frankly, my experience in transportation and in technology is that transportation is 10 or 15 years behind in technology generally. And this study has borne that out. We're probably 10 to 15 years behind as it relates to cybersecurity preparedness.
Scott, this is Eric. Let me just add in one thought there. I regularly review contracts that have provisions for cybersecurity in them. One of the big ones you see traditionally is physical access controls, where any system that is supposed to be reaching into a mainframe or sensitive data is supposed to only be accessible in a room that, for example, has badge access, and where you have an audit trail of who's been in that room. And those contractual provisions are going out the window because of all the remote working that's going on. And this is not just in the transit sector, but it gives you an idea of, under normal circumstances, physical access would be something that companies, transit agencies, and others alike would prioritize, but they can't now. It's not realistic, except for in some limited circumstances where it remains practical to insist that people do not access systems remotely. They're going into the office to do the work that they're doing.
And just let me just introduce this. Eric Greenwald, who was one of the chief researchers on this project, worked as a special advisor to the president on cybersecurity, worked on the Hill on cybersecurity, has quite an extensive background, and was really instrumental in pulling this together. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that additional perspective. I'm noting that we only have time for one last question. This has gone way too fast, but another question that's been submitted to us: what tools are currently most effective against a transit agency's cyber threat?
So, go ahead, Eric.
Well, yeah, so that is not an easy question to answer. It really depends upon the nature of the threat, but there are some really basic security measures that can be implemented. I'd say if you wanted to ask me what's the biggest bang for the buck, it's two-factor authentication, especially for remote access to transportation agencies' networks of any kind, especially anything that might be an operational technology system. But having at least that additional layer of protection against unauthorized remote access is probably biggest bang for the buck. But it really is, it's difficult to answer that question in an absolute way.
And sure. If I had to add to that, I would say, and I said it 7 times in the last half hour, that you should farm out anything that's PCI compliant. You should have that in a contract with somebody else handling it. And you should make sure that your contract holds them responsible, and that they have cybersecurity controls in place.
Well, thank you for this critically important, thought-provoking, and a little bit frightening presentation today. For those of you who have joined us, if you'd like to learn more, the full report with all of the details is available for free download on the MTI website. Additionally, a recording of today's SNAP webinar will be made available later today and will be sent to all attendees. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to our next Research SNAP webinar, which will be held on December 3rd, and it will answer the question, will ride-hailing enhance mobility for older adults? Again, to our esteemed panelists today, thank you. Thank you for your hard work, and thank you for helping to make our industry safe. I bid you all farewell. Have a great day, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.